This little jump scare was inspired by a Portal 1 mod I playtested, which was never released. The setup was similar to this, with a turret pointing directly at the chamber sign, but I added a lot of subtle changes. The sign has been shot by the turrets, and the complementary blood decals on the floor tell a very clear story. The turret's laser beam is off at first, only activating once the player jumps down. The small drop ensures that players can't peek the corner to see the turret or flee back to safety when the turret activates. The broken chamber sign was only added for aesthetic reasons at first, but it ended up playing into our cards for the turret jump scare. Many players stare at it as they fall down, turning their back to the turret, which makes their surprise ever more powerful.
Whoa, wait a minute! No wonder the mortality rate of that chamber is so high. You can't even get past the first turret. Blind turn. Does that help?
I wanted to make a broken test chamber sign for this map. I knew roughly what I wanted it to look like, but I still tried to find reference. And I couldn't. First of all, what kind of display is this? It's certainly not CRT, but if you search for a broken screen, you'll just find a bunch of flickering CRT displays. It's a cool and creepy look, but those analog artifacts don't make sense for this huge screen. It looks more like an LCD or LED screen, but those don't break in very interesting ways. More often than not, they just turn black and have permanent pixel errors, and no cool flickering effect. I ended up layering a bunch of color stripes and black overlays to roughly imitate how those kinds of screens would usually break. What you see here is the first export straight out of Blender. The refractive glass in front carries a lot of weight. I also thought about animating it, but the static look was already cool enough. I saw that some speedrunners were trying to solve Portal Revolution with as few portals as possible. They could solve many chambers with no portals at all, and this room was the source of a lot of frustration since there's no way to get past. If you don't have a portal or physics objects, there's not a lot of tricks you can do. I quietly updated the map and added this camera that pops off as soon as the wall moves, which gives them something to play with. I usually don't modify chambers to give speedrunners an advantage, the same way I try to stay out of the way by intentionally not fixing exploits. But adding this camera makes the chamber more interesting to me, not less.
Great.
We wanted to give players an opportunity to play around with the new fully upgraded portal gun. This turret chamber isn't very hard, but it encourages players to be imaginative. The pacifist achievement then adds another challenge on top for the completionists. The geometry in this chamber is inspired by early Portal 1 mods and map packs, like the Flash version map pack and Portal Prelude. Their maps often followed a bit of a 2D design, with stuff stacked on top of each other in a straight line. It's hard to describe. I modeled this bridge with the turrets above the glass after that style of mapping. Players often wouldn't intuitively trust that the ceiling surface aligns with the floor where the turrets stand on. The depth is hard to gauge from the entrance, so we added these little beams to the corners. This little bit of geometry makes it obvious that the two blocks are aligned. The lights above the wall behind, which uses a slightly different color temperature than the surroundings, also make it stand out.
Later.
This chamber is heavily dependent on bouncing around physics objects in a predictable and reproducible manner. Here you can see all the invisible catapults added to achieve this. When everything works as intended, the ball doesn't even use the blue gel to reach its final destination. It is instead using a precise catapult that gets enabled when the surface underneath is painted. We also added a catapult to reliably bounce painted balls off the floor button. Without this, balls would often bounce straight up and then back down, enabling the tractor beam for a split second, which then cancels the player's momentum during the fling. What should the difficulty curve of a Portal game be? You might think it should be a constant rise, but if you do this over a campaign as long as Portal 2 or Revolution, fatigue will set in very quickly. Instead, we did what Portal 2 does, where difficulty slowly rises and falls throughout the chapters, like a sawtooth pattern. Every time a new element is introduced, you get a simple intro, followed by expansion, and ending in graduation, where you have now proven that you mastered this element. Whenever a new element comes along, the difficulty drops so you can learn the ropes. The difficulty still rises over time, but this is mainly a consequence of cumulative complexity, where more and more elements are used in combination. Many veteran players remark that Revolution is way too easy for them, which matches our design. Revolution is built for all players, and we don't want to lose people too quickly. Whatever you do, you can never please everybody. What's important is that you stick to one consistent difficulty. This room was originally used halfway through the Overgrown chapters, where the player would finally get the fully upgraded portal gun. At that point, the vista here was just a rather undetailed mountain skybox. We didn't know what we wanted to show you in the vista, so we moved it to the end of the act, where we already planned to have an outlook vista for the spire. Like with many of our areas, this vista brings together cut areas of the game that never found a home. Originally, the beginning of the Overgrown chapter featured a huge vista, where one could see a cross-section of the Aperture facility. Trees and nature on top, with the facility and test chambers hidden below in the salt mines. That vista was way too ambitious for us to build or for Source to render, and featured no gameplay for how expansive it was. We cut that map, but still liked the idea of a cross-section, so I'm glad we managed to find a home for it in this final vista. This is the opening trailer shot. The trailer took a really long time to make, but it was 100% worth it. It did a lot better than we expected, surpassing 1 million views in about a week, which made it the most viewed Portal mod trailer on YouTube. We've been quiet and low-key on the marketing side up until this point. The team wanted us to do more marketing efforts earlier, but at the time the game was still evolving so much so quickly that we were simply in no position to announce anything. I mean, what were we supposed to show? We only came up with those ideas a week ago. Announcing stuff early pins us down creatively, so we waited quite a long time before we actually made a trailer, at which point the game was only a few months before release. I think this turned out pretty well for us. One lesson we learned from the trailer was not pin down an exact release date. Portal Revolution usually sticks to a pretty standard color palette, but every now and then we like to add some more striking colors. The lighting in this vista uses a simple scheme of analogous colors, red, orange, yellow. Analogous color palettes rarely look bad, and allow us to play more with contrast and value. The bridge to the spire was originally placed right after the first vista, but it was cast in complete shadow due to its placement. We wanted the bridge to be in dramatic sunlight and moved it to where it is now. This meant that the distance between vista and bridge is now much larger. At first the map wasn't intended to have any puzzles, so now we had to come up with some gameplay we can add to bridge the gap to the bridge.
The image of the setting sun in the back was what kind of drove the feel of this track for the most part. I wanted to convey a sense of accomplishment with Sterling and Kate finally seeing their destination in the distance.
The old-fashioned way.
These power switches were a late addition to the game. When I got the idea, I didn't think there was enough time to add it in, but then I remembered that this map was lacking some connective tissue. Power switches served as a great pacebreaker element to the end of the chapter. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to playtest and iterate on this concept, and didn't realize how much potential it had. It seemed like a gimmick at first, but turns out to be quite the game changer. Power switches interact with almost all test elements, and both the on and off states have desirable effects. This introduction chamber used to be much smaller, but we later merged in some elements from a later chamber to save space. The second vista was placed to remind players of the goal and their progress towards that goal. As you may have gathered by now, we like building connected spaces like this. Lighting this area was tricky. We needed enough sunlight from the right side of the spire to reach all the way here. So all the angles, spacing and positioning of the bridge, the spire, the walkway and shadow catching geometry had to be carefully placed. The second power switch chamber went through a lot of iteration. During the design process, it's easy to get carried away or build overly complicated contraptions. This chamber originally featured 2 port-level platforms that would extend out of the water. You were supposed to use them to preserve the cube's momentum while the power is out, to then fling it through a deactivated Death Fizzler. The Death Fizzler, as well as the platforms, were only there to fix an unintended solution, where players could fling the cube from the catapult to the button straight away without using the power switch. All this extra complexity really detracted from the core mechanic of this chamber, which is to deactivate a catapult using the power switch. Turns out none of that was needed. All we had to do was add glass in front of the angled surface, and with that change we could remove all of this garbage. This third vista came together by complete accident. Originally, the previous test chamber would connect straight to the room in front of the bridge. I asked another mapper if they could start to fill these huge walls with some decoration, who then added this little observation room. It was not intended for gameplay and was sparsely decorated, but I liked how the lighting inside looked. We then rerouted the pathway to snake through here and added all the greenery needed to make this a nice and happy accident.
After you.
The spire interior obviously has no way to fit inside this model. We experimented with different sizes for the spire, but anything close to realistic just looked way too comically large and would have required a lot of decoration work from us. We chose to cheat the transition using a world portal, and players didn't really seem to mind that in the next map the interior magically became 4 times larger than it is supposed to be. We added this little office area to bridge the strong visual contrast between the spire interior and the outside. The inside is sterile, white and clean. Somehow the overgrowth doesn't get in here, adding to the intrigue of what the spire actually is. This map used to start right before the spire interior, but this shift felt too drastic after the level transition. It felt like you had just skipped a level. So we added this little dirty and dimly lit area to better connect both maps. We then also had the opportunity for some foreshadowing on posters and found a place to put the uncensored presentation slides from all the way back in Chapter 2.
Here, we are finally introduced to the theme of the spire. It is derived from the old Gregorian chant Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, which is often used to represent some impending doom or death whenever it's used in film or TV. You can't super tell it's Dies Irae until the final boss, which is where I use it straight up and it goes like do, 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 do. For the spire, I also used big, bassy synths to give it this feeling of scale. The almost aquatic sounds underneath are there to give it this otherworldly feeling as well.
Wait, that's it?
I also did the sound design for the spire's teleportation sequence. I utilized the same sounds as the quantum cubes to imply a connection between them, but you won't see them for a while.
We wanted to incorporate some Half-Life elements into the mod. The teleportation failure is very reminiscent of the iconic resonance cascade in Half-Life 1 and the teleporter failure at the beginning of Half-Life 2. We didn't want the teleporter to fail for no reason, so when we added the broken portal gun model, it felt natural that it was the cause for the failure. You just tried to teleport teleportation equipment and it didn't go well. We could then also break the portal gun to make the beginning of the next chapter feel even more isolating and defeated. The spire interior was inspired by a lot of different stuff. The metallic floor and wall tiles were inspired by the Narkina 5 prison in Star Wars Andor. The general concept of the spire core was influenced by the Citadel core seen in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. We also liked the collider from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. The circular lights on the walls in the core chamber came from that.
We designed